It was a gray Wednesday afternoon when Daniel Harris, a retired postal worker, drove the same empty stretch of country road he had traveled 1,000 times before. His mind was heavy with the loneliness that had thickened since his wife's passing 2 years earlier. Most days, the silence of his small home was a dull ache. Today, it felt unbearable. He turned up the old radio, hoping a song might drown out the heaviness in his chest. As he crested a familiar hill, a sudden flicker of motion on the shoulder caught his eye. A car sped past him, its taillights disappearing around a bend, but something small and unnatural had tumbled from its window. Daniel instinctively pulled over, his heart tightening with a strange urgency he didn't understand yet. For a long moment, he just sat there, staring into the drizzle. Stepping out of his truck, he heard nothing but the steady patter of rain on the asphalt and the whisper of the wind through the bare trees. Still, something pulled him toward the roadside ditch, a gnawing feeling he couldn't shake. As he approached, he spotted a tiny figure lying motionless in the wet grass, so small he could have missed it entirely. It was a kitten, barely old enough to walk, its fur matted with mud and specks of blood. Daniel knelt down, his fingers trembling as he reached out but hesitated an inch away, afraid that even his touch might cause more harm. The kitten didn't cry, didn't move, just blinked once, so slowly it nearly broke him in half. Daniel's heart hammered against his ribs as memories of the hospital, the machines, the wires, the awful, sterile silence after his wife's last breath, crashed back into him. He had sworn he wouldn't go through that helplessness again. But here it was, raw and living, lying in the rain at his feet. He swallowed hard, blinking away the sting in his eyes. The kitten's chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths. Daniel fumbled off his jacket and gently wrapped it around the tiny body, feeling its frail warmth through the fabric. His hands moved automatically, the way his wife's used to when patching up hurt animals they found near the farm. He realized with a jolt that this was the first time he had touched anything living in months. A flash of headlights in the distance snapped him back to the moment. Should he take the kitten? Was it even legal? What if someone saw him and thought he was stealing it, or worse? His breath quickened, the familiar claws of doubt digging in. But when he looked down at the helpless bundle in his arms, he knew there was no real choice. Behind him, the wind picked up, carrying with it the faint, almost imperceptible sound of another car approaching. Time seemed to hang suspended, the world narrowing to Daniel, the kitten, and the decision he couldn't avoid. The storm clouds thickened above them, casting a heavy shadow over the narrow road. Daniel tightened his grip around the kitten and rose to his feet just as the rain began to fall harder. With a deep, steadying breath, he turned back toward his truck, shielding the small, broken life in his arms. He didn't know what lay ahead, only that he couldn't leave it behind. And as he closed the truck door behind him, the kitten let out the faintest sound, more breath than meow, and Daniel knew it wasn't just the kitten who needed saving. Daniel cranked the heat up in the truck, the windows fogging almost immediately from the damp air and his own shallow breathing. He laid the jacket on the passenger seat, peeling it back just enough to check the kitten's fragile body. Bruises darkened its tiny limbs, and one paw was bent at a sickening angle. Its eyes barely stayed open, as if the effort of being alive was already too much. The drive to the nearest town was nearly 30 minutes, and Daniel's mind raced the whole way. Every bump in the road made the kitten whimper soundlessly, a shiver running through its tiny frame. Daniel clenched the steering wheel tighter, guilt gnawing at him for every jolt he couldn't avoid. He whispered promises he wasn't sure he could keep, just to fill the thick silence. When he pulled into the town's only veterinary clinic, his heart sank. A handwritten sign taped to the door read, "Closed emergency calls only." For a moment, Daniel sat frozen behind the wheel, paralyzed by the weight of uncertainty. He had no emergency number, no plan, and no idea what to do next. The rain hammered harder against the windshield as he considered his options. He thought about leaving the kitten at the clinic door, wrapped in his jacket, hoping someone would find it before it was too late. But the thought of abandoning it after everything made his stomach turn. He knew too well what being left behind felt like. He carefully scooped the kitten back into his arms and trudged to the clinic entrance, his boots splashing through the puddles. Shielding the tiny creature from the rain, he pounded on the glass, praying someone would hear him. His knock echoed into the emptiness, answered only by the distant rumble of thunder. Just as he was about to give up, a shadow moved behind the frosted glass. A woman in scrubs unlocked the door with a wary glance. She took one look at the kitten, and without a word, waved Daniel inside. The warm, antiseptic air hit him like a wave, stirring 100 memories of sterile hospital rooms and goodbyes whispered into nothingness. The vet tech, Sarah, her name tag read, hustled them into an exam room, barking quick, efficient questions. How long ago? Any other injuries? Daniel stumbled over his answers, ashamed at how little he knew. All he could offer was the truth. The kitten had been thrown away like garbage, and he couldn't walk away from it. Sarah's brow furrowed as she examined the kitten, her hands gentle but firm. She rattled off a list of issues: dehydration, fractures, possible internal bleeding. Daniel's stomach knotted tighter with every word. The estimate for emergency care would be high, she warned, maybe higher than Daniel's fixed retirement income could handle. He hesitated, feeling the familiar fear of not being enough, of letting someone or something down again. But then the kitten stirred weakly under the warm lights, its paw twitching toward Daniel's hand as if recognizing him. The decision wasn't a decision anymore. He pulled out his wallet with shaking fingers and said, "Do whatever you have to. Please." Sarah nodded once, brisk and businesslike, and rushed the kitten into the back. Daniel was left standing alone in the sterile, too-quiet room, jacket damp in his hands, heart cracked wide open. He didn't know what saving this kitten would cost him. He only knew he couldn't turn away. Hours passed in a blur as Daniel waited in the hard plastic chair, the walls around him humming with the low buzz of fluorescent lights. His mind played cruel tricks, flashing images of worst-case scenarios he couldn't bear to see happen again. Every time the clinic door creaked open, his heart leapt, and then sank when it wasn't Sarah returning with news. Finally, she emerged, peeling off her gloves, her expression a tired but genuine softness. "He's stable for now," she said, and Daniel's knees nearly gave out with relief. The kitten had 2 broken ribs, a fractured leg, and was severely malnourished, but he had a fighting chance. Daniel hadn't realized he was holding his breath until it escaped in a shaky sob. Sarah led him to a small recovery area, where the kitten lay bundled in blankets, an IV running into his tiny foreleg. His eyes fluttered open as Daniel approached, and for the first time, Daniel saw not just pain, but trust, fragile and tentative, like a thread being offered across a chasm. He reached out a careful finger, and the kitten pressed his head weakly into it. The connection hit Daniel like a jolt, sudden and overwhelming. He wasn't just saving a life, he was reclaiming something he thought he had lost with his wife. The ability to care, to fight for something small and defenseless, to matter again. Tears blurred his vision, but he didn't wipe them away. Sarah handed him a clipboard with forms and medications he barely understood. "He'll need weeks of care," she said gently, "but he's a tough little guy." Daniel nodded, already knowing that no matter what it took, he wasn't going to leave him behind. He signed the papers, the pen heavy in his trembling hand. As they left the clinic together, Daniel carrying the kitten carefully in a cardboard carrier, a few people watched from the waiting room with soft, knowing smiles. An elderly woman dabbed her eyes with a tissue. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, whispering excitedly about the tiny hero. For the first time in a long time, Daniel didn't feel invisible. Driving home, he talked to the kitten as if it could understand him, filling the dark cab of the truck with one-sided conversation. "You're tougher than me, little guy," he said, glancing down at the carrier on the seat beside him. "But we're gonna figure this out, both of us." He didn't recognize his own voice, lighter, almost hopeful. Back at his house, Daniel transformed the spare bedroom, once his wife's sewing room, into a makeshift recovery center. He laid out soft towels, bought kitten formula and syringes, and read every guide he could find online. Every small task gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years, knitting pieces of himself back together. Each day, the kitten, whom Daniel quietly named Chance, grew a little stronger, and so did Daniel. When Chance first managed a wobbly step toward him, tiny paws slipping on the hardwood floor, Daniel laughed, a raw, broken sound that slowly healed into something whole. It wasn't just Chance who was fighting to survive. It was Daniel too. Weeks turned into months, and the seasons shifted from bleak winter to the soft promises of spring. Daniel's home, once silent and heavy with grief, now pulsed with small signs of life. Tiny paw prints on the kitchen tiles, the crinkle of a toy mouse batting across the floor, the The warm weight of Chance curled up in the crook of his arm at night. The loneliness didn't vanish, but it no longer ruled him. Daniel's days took on a new rhythm. Early mornings feeding Chance, afternoons tending to the small garden his wife had once loved, and evenings with Chance perched on his lap, purring so loudly it seemed to echo in the quiet house. Each small moment felt like stitching up a tear he had thought would never mend. Healing wasn't grand or sudden, it was hidden in everyday tenderness. Neighbors began to notice the change. The mailman started waving again when he passed by. Mrs. Carter, who lived across the street, dropped off fresh-baked pies with a wink. Even Daniel's son, estranged for years after painful misunderstandings, called one evening just to check in. The walls Daniel had built around himself started to crumble, brick by careful brick. Chance grew into a feisty young cat, his once fragile body now sturdy and mischievous. He had a particular talent for escaping the screen porch, always waiting by the front door afterward, looking unapologetic. Daniel would pretend to scold him, but secretly reveled in the stubborn spirit they both shared. Survival wasn't neat. It was messy, stubborn, and beautiful. One evening, Daniel sat on the porch. Chance sprawled across his lap, watching the sunset bleed gold and purple across the sky. A few kids from the neighborhood biked past, waving and shouting, "Hi, Mr. Harris!" Daniel waved back, surprised at how natural it felt. For the first time in what felt like forever, he belonged not to a past that was gone, but to a present he was still building. Motivated by Chance's recovery, Daniel quietly started volunteering at the local animal shelter. At first, he just dropped off supplies, avoiding conversation, but soon he found himself spending hours there, fixing broken cages, cleaning food bowls, and sometimes just sitting with the animals who needed a calm presence. In their eyes, he saw the same quiet fight to be seen that he had once carried inside himself. Stories of Daniel and Chance spread through the small town. A reporter even wrote a piece titled "A Second Chance for Two Souls," featuring a picture of Daniel holding Chance proudly on his shoulder. The photo captured more than just a man and his cat. It captured a moment of redemption, a living proof that no life, no matter how broken, was beyond saving. One afternoon, as Daniel pinned the newspaper clipping to the fridge, he caught his reflection in the window. For the first time in years, he didn't see a man defined by loss. He saw someone who had chosen to stay, to love, to fight for something fragile and precious, even when it would have been easier to walk away. And in that choice, he had found himself again. Chance, perched on the back of the worn armchair, let out a sharp, playful meow, demanding attention. Daniel chuckled, crossing the room to scoop him into his arms. He pressed his forehead to Chance's soft fur and whispered, "You didn't just survive, buddy. You saved me." Because in the end, Daniel hadn't just rescued a kitten thrown from a moving car. He had rescued the parts of himself he thought were lost forever. If this story touched your heart like it did mine, I would love for you to be part of our special community. I am opening a members-only club where we share even more real stories of hope, healing, and second chances, both human and animal. I will leave the link to join in the first comment below. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end. Your time and heart mean more than you know. Until next time, take care of yourself and those who need a little extra love.